So we covered modernization theory, and the last theory that I want to introduce before we do review and wrap up and all of that. Next week we're going to do review, we're going to do wrap up, but I want to cover the paper rubric today because the paper's due next week. I had a couple of people turn in a paper. Early submissions are usually the A students, and so it's not really a good metric to say, is the paper rubric good? Because those individuals were going to get an A, they were really going to put in the effort and probably have always been A students, and so it's not really a good metric to see if it's a good paper, because they might put in more work than is really appropriate for a 200 level course. So we're going to go over the rubric so you know what you need to do, what you need to have available. But before we do that, let's go into the last theory that we will discuss in this course, which is dependency theory. And the dependency theory really does give us a unique look into what, a unique look into what we've been discussing. That's not the right place, sorry. That's not what I wanted. Okay. So dependency theory is going to work in a very specific way. It is also a structural argument, right? If you notice, there's a lot of structural arguments. The structure does this. We didn't talk about as much agency arguments. Not that they aren't like how people impact their environment. There are some really great agency arguments to be made. They're just a little more complex, and without having you in the classroom, and without experience, and because most of you are not political science majors, it's a little more than is necessary for this course, and it's a little harder. So we've mostly been doing structural theories about how the structure impacts. So first, let's look at some terminology. And some of this might be new, but hopefully it's not too new for most of you. The first is this idea of raw goods. So we're talking about resources like crude oil, bauxite, cotton, anything that just is not processed at all, that's just pulled out of the ground, right? Whether you grow it, whether you mine it, whether you drill for it, that's not the concern here. It's just this is a raw good, it's completely unprocessed. And then you have a low value added good, right? A low value added good is just a minimum amount of processing to make it into a sellable product. Textiles, cotton made into any type of denim or fabric, right? Anytime you take cotton and you make it into something flat, that's a low value added good. Because you still haven't designed it, made it to something high value. And usually this is done largely by hand or through some sort of simple machinery, right? There's no assembly line, right? This is, right, South Korea did this in shops, right? There wasn't a ton of technology showing sewing machines maybe, but for the most part, automated looms and just getting fabric, turning cotton into a textile, right? Into some sort of fabric. And I'm using the case of denim because for now, because it's going to make more sense. Clay pots, right? You're just taking clay, which is a raw resource, and turning it into something that you can sell. Right? Obviously, these products are not high value. A high value added good is sort of a finished product, has complex parts. A cell phone is a high value added good because you take the metal that was processed, right? The bauxite, the gold. You take the wiring that's created, right? And even, right, that some immediate value goods or high value goods are put into other high value goods, like a microchip and things like that. Obviously, cell phones, computers, machinery, right? If you're making textiles, right, you're going to have to buy some large automated looms or programmable looms, things like that. And so all of that stuff has really high value. And it takes a lot of textiles to pay for one machine, right? And then the last term, which is going to become very important, I really want you to know this, is balance of payment problems. And all balance of payment problems means is that the monthly expenses of a state are greater, right, than the amount of income they have, right? And we use the term the fiscal requirements exceed the extractive capacity. Right? Their ability to take an income is lower than their ability to pay their debts and their employees, right? The Soviet Union, right after it broke up, Russia was no longer able to pay its soldiers. So it ran into a problem, but it just stopped paying its soldiers. The most balance of payment problems occur because of debt, right? If you have credit card debt and a cell phone bill and a car, a car loan and a mortgage and all of those things, and the amount you're making each month is less than the cost that you have, you can't get rid of, right? That you can't really get rid of your car or your home, right? You need those things. Those are necessary things, right? Then you have a balance of payment problem, right? You have a balance of payments problem, right? Balance of payment problem. So this is plural in that there are multiple states that have it, but it's a balance of payment problem. It's not problems, it's one problem, but it's a balance of payment problem. So, right, we want that language so that I can discuss this other part, right? This is just terminology that when I say that, that's what I mean, right? So how does dependency theory work, right? How do we get into a position where weak states, what we'll call the global south, is sort of stuck under the global north, right? The United States, Western Europe, right? And even including Russia and China. China becomes part of the global north, even though they're not really in the north, but it's sort of this larger term that talks about powerful states. So you're small, right? I'm going to consider that you're a small state. You're Costa Rica, you're the Philippines, you're Malaysia, you're a smaller state economically. You might even have a high population like India, right? India has over 1 billion people. Still a weaker global south state because its economy was not developed. And so you start exporting raw goods and low value added goods. You start exporting that crude oil. You start exporting textiles. You start exporting denim, right? Denim's a really good example because it's gonna make sense in a minute. The states that are buying those exports are in large the United States, Western Europe, Russia, and China, right? Those are the big global north powers. And so they buy these exports. And so you go through the process of taking cotton and you make it into denim. And then you export it to the United States because denim is very, very popular in the United States, right? The denim is much more common here in the United States than in other parts of the world, right? One of the things that used to be true, I don't know if it's true anymore because shipping's gotten better, but it used to be true that blue jeans were so valuable, especially Levi's were so valuable in parts of Europe that many tourists would buy Levi's here and then take them home because they're so much cheaper here than they are in other places. So the global north buys all this cotton, buys all this denim, right? Whether it buys the cotton or the denim, whoever buys it, and then it turns that denim into jeans, right? Blue jeans. And then it exports the blue jeans, right? And so then those products are being sold back to the weak states. And the weaker states, the economically weak states, they're buying these finished products, right? They're buying the blue jeans. They're also, because they want to make their own denim, they want to make their own blue jeans, they're buying all the machinery to make blue jeans. And where did that machinery come from? The global north, right? So I'm selling you something that's cheap, right? I'm selling you cotton that's cheap. And I'm buying from you jeans, machinery, and then support services, which we'll talk a lot about intellectual property at the end of this. But when you're dealing with support services, I might sell you the machine, but I'm not going to tell you how it works. I'm going to sell you a support that works it, right? I'm going to sell you a team that comes and installs it. So you're going to pay the global north state, right, the powerful economic state, to come and install the machinery. You're going to pay that state, right, or that company in that state, remember, because this is a trade deficit. So, right, some company from the powerful state comes in, sets it up. Whenever you have a problem, you go through that, you pay for support, so if there's ever a maintenance issue, that company comes and fixes it. If you ever need a new part, right, you have to order the part from the company that made the machinery. And so this makes it so that the amount you're spending, right, the amount you're spending for the finished products or for just the machinery to make the denim, right? Just to make the denim, you're spending all this machinery, and what you end up is a trade deficit. And a trade deficit just means that the amount that you're spending on the goods coming in is more than the amount you're getting, the revenue you're getting by exporting. And this trade deficit is the first part of dependency theory. Essentially, powerful states can sell you high value added goods, even though they're selling them in smaller quantities, but they have so much value added that the amount of wealth the amount of wealth that it takes to buy those high value goods is pushing it in the direction of the powerful state. So instead of your state, right, making money through trade, it's losing money through trade, and that wealth is being extracted and put into a powerful state. So that's the first problem, right? Is that you're actually losing money. Your state's losing money in this exchange. Yes, you're selling a low value good and you're getting machinery and genes and things that your population wants, but there's less wealth in your state. So then we go to the next part, which is debt. So you have bureaucratic employees, you have a military, you have government expenses, you have all of these factors. I can't get this down my diagram. I had to overbreathe, so. So when we're talking about this, the next part, I was just staring at a light. Blinding. The next part that we're going to talk about, sorry, I know it's distracting. The next part is debt. So because you can't pay all of your costs, right, your fiscal requirement is the same, right, but the amount of money that you're bringing in is not covering all those bureaucrats, all those patronage jobs, all those client networks, right? You have to pay off your client networks, right? You have to provide services to your population, right? All of these things cost money, and you can't pay it. So you start with a debt, a loan, a short-term loan to cover the gap, right? And this is just a normal loan, right? In any sense that you would get into, but it's very similar to what we've called payday loans. For those of you that have ever dealt with payday loan, this will be very clear. You borrow because you're like, well, I'm going to make a certain amount of money off of the sale of this denim, right? And so I can't pay my debts right now, but I know that I'm going to tax those exports and those imports, and so I'll be able to pay back this loan. So loan me, X amount of dollars, $10 million, and then I will repay that between now and the end of the year, right? And so I'm going to repay that. And it's fine because of the revenue they're making, right? Not all loans are bad. Not all debt is bad loans, right? If you buy a home and you have a mortgage, that's not a bad thing, right? Yes, you have to pay on that mortgage, but you're a homeowner, right? Most of us will have to finance a vehicle. Yes, I'm paying a car payment, but it drives me to work, right? It allows me to have other opportunities, right? So not all debt is bad. Not all debt is bad. In fact, this is one of those things that we are confused about is debt doesn't work the way that we think. But one of the things it does do is it limits how much income is actually going to other things, right? Now you're having to pay on that debt. And so over time, this accumulation, the same way that payday loans work, you thought you had a certain amount of money, but that debt keeps hitting you, right? Paying the amount of the payment on that debt. And so each time you hit the next cycle, the next month, the next week, whatever it is, you're still short. And now you're short than the amount that you were short last week, and you're short the payment for the loan. And so you start getting into more problems, and you start taking out more debt. And then eventually, right, a state gets to a point where it has so much debt and such a bad trade deficit that it can't afford to pay for its essential services. And then the state reaches out to international institutions and says, hey, I'm at the point where I should be filing bankruptcy, but states can't file bankruptcy. What they can do is default on the debt. They can say, I'm just not going to pay this debt back. Right? I don't know what else you want me to cover, but I will not be able to pay this debt back. So I'm going to default on it. And the international community doesn't want you to default on debts because if you could just default on debts, why loan anyone anything, right? That people would not loan money, corporations, right? Loans won't go out unless there is an assumption that you will at some point get paid for that debt, right? There has to be part of that. Sorry. So, because they don't want a default, with the international institutions, WTO is World Trade Organization, which doesn't deal with loans, but does deal in trade disputes. So if you think you're at a disadvantaged trade position, then the World Trade Organization works. The World Bank and the IMF, they do structural loans, right? And so this is all part of dependency theory. you have a trade deficit. So then you start taking in debt. And then because you have too much debt, then you need to restructure that debt to be able to continue to function as a state. When you do this, the World Bank and the IMF, they say, okay, we will give you a loan to restructure your debt. And what we'll do is instead of paying it back over a year, we'll let you pay it back over 30 years. And so you're making the payments smaller, right? So that the state can actually function, right? This is the first part. This is the part that is sort of the part that is supposed to be helping the state. Why the state is agreeing to this. The state says, okay, if you restructure my debt and instead of paying it back in a year, I pay it back in 30 years, then I can manage. My income and my extractive capacity and my fiscal requirements will meet. So I will be able to pay my debts based on the restructured loan, right? I'll be able to pay my debts and pay my services. Well, the World Bank and the IMF, for a long time, they called for structural adjustment loans, or SALs. And what they said is, yes, we'll loan you the money, but we have some conditions. We have some conditions that you have to meet. The first is that you have to engage in austerity, right? We talked about this between Hayek and Keynes before, right? So Hayek says, when things are going bad in your economy, the government should cut costs, right? And so these international institutions say, yes, we'll loan you the money, but you need to fire about 30% of your bureaucracy. You need to get rid of some of those jobs that you're paying for. You need to cut down on that. So you have lower costs, right? Not just more revenue, but lower costs is very important. And the next part is you need to cut the tariffs. You need to open up trade in your state, right? You need to open up trade in your state. So this is one of those things that is sort of problematic, right? You can sort of already see it. Well, great, I am going to get the loan to restructure it, but now I have less bureaucracy, which means more unemployed people in my state, which is not going to go well politically, right? I could lose an election, I could lose the support of my elites, right? And then cut tariffs, but tariffs are how I prevent a trade deficit, right? So that just means I'm going to get more goods coming in, and I'm going to be more open to this, right? And so this is all part of the dependency. It starts with trade deficit, and then you go into debt, and then when you have to restructure that debt, the international institutions have enough power. Did I bring in the wrong version? Okay. The international have enough institutions to sort of force certain conditions. So why do they do this, right? Why do they do it? And there's a couple of reasons. The first is this idea of the Chicago School. So in the 1990s, leading into the 1990s, moving forward, the Chicago School of Thought, this is economics, in Chicago there's a university, and we just call it the Chicago School. I want to say University of Illinois, but it might be a private or an Ivy League. But the relevant part is that these economists came up with this idea called comparative advantage. And the way that comparative advantage works is that you produce the product that you're best at producing, right? And a lot of times I worry about stereotypes when I'm doing this, but let's say that you're in Mexico, and what are the products that you can produce really well? Agave is very valuable, right? It makes alcohol, so agave is very valuable, and it grows in only a few places on the planet, so you have comparative advantage, right? You can grow a lot of agave and then other products. If you're in the Netherlands, right, fishing, there's Atlantic cod that is very populous in that is very easy to fish in that northern sort of Atlantic Arctic area. Fishing is very plentiful there, right? And so what should happen is Mexico should focus on agave growth, and the Netherlands and those Nordic countries, they should focus on fishing, right? That France should grow wine grapes, right? That California should grow sort of avocados and garlic and asparagus, the things that they do grow, but instead of trying to industrialize, right, instead of import substitution industrialization, where they use that to make another industry, they should just focus on that. They should just be the best at that product that they can possibly be, right? They should look at the products where they have an advantage over other states, and they should focus on those. And because this becomes the norm, the international norm, that whenever there's a restructuring loan, states are told, no, don't try import substitution industrialization, right? South Korea, when it was going to import substitution industrialization, it fought constantly with the international powerful states because they kept telling it to open up trade. And South Korea kept saying, no, we're not going to open it. and there were threats of sanctions, right? South Korea is developed economically despite the international norms, right? It fought against national norms. And many states have argued, right, this is part of dependency theory, is that the international norm is comparative advantage. You're saying, no, don't try to industrialize. Just be the best at growing whatever product. Just being the best at exporting whatever product you have. But the success stories are largely import substitution industrialization. I use this product to protect another industry to help develop a highly advanced society, right? So the norms, the economic norms that exist go against the real world examples in dependency theory, according to dependency theory. So you have this problem where the norms, the forced conditions, the forced structural conditions of restructuring your debt and a loan system is pushed by these norms that don't really match reality and don't fit with the powerful norms, right? France doesn't just grow grapevines, it developed a computer and technology company, a corporate espionage branch of the government, right? France makes a lot of money by stealing ideas and technology from other companies, including the United States, right? The United States has an entire, it's called Federalist 10 as far as the paper, I want to say Hamilton, but at the very beginning of the United States, right, you had authors who became leaders in the United States saying we need to develop a manufacturing base, we need diversity, right? The arguments that are made by the Chicago School don't fit the historical examples, and the states that are pushing for this comparative advantage didn't use comparative advantage to develop, right? And so you're pushing a theory that doesn't match history and doesn't match the behavior of the powerful states. And so it becomes this problem, right? That academically there's a mismatch between the real world and the theories that are being pushed, right? And economics has always had this problem where there's sort of competing theories and why are they adopted? So dependency theory says, well, first, the global north is pushing a theoretical perspective that they didn't follow and isn't historically accurate. So it's not going to work because it doesn't fit, right? And so that's part of dependency theory, because what happens next is the institutions, they determine loans, and they're forcing this theory on these states, right? So if you need a loan from the International Monetary Fund to restructure your debt, and they say structural adjustment, austerity, right, comparative advantage, you're arguing like, no, that won't work, and you know it won't work. Academically, you know it won't work. There's been a lot of papers that don't support comparative advantage, that say ISI is a better choice. But you're forcing my hand into this. Either I get the loan and I have to take a path that I know won't help me, or I don't get the loan and then I have to start defaulting, or I have to start cutting programs, and my government or my state might collapse. You're putting me in an impossible position, right? And so this is the end point of dependency, right? This is how dependency theory points out. You are putting some of these weaker states, the global south, in a position where they're constantly being undermined, where they're constantly being held at a disadvantage, and the institutions they go to are dominated by powerful states. Now, one of the things about powerful states that is very frustrating for dependency theorists is vote share. So your percentage, the amount of votes you get in the IMF and the World Bank is not 1-to-1. In the UN, every state gets one vote. In the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, the amount of votes you get is directly tied to your contribution. And your contribution is about 1 to 3%, not 1 to 3%, that's way too high. It's less than 1% of your GDP, right? And so if you have a larger economy, you get more votes in those organizations, in those international institutions, those INGOs, right? Intergovernmental organizations. Sorry. So when you have these organizations that are the vote share, the majority of the votes are coming from the United States, the United Kingdom, right, France, Russia, and China, they can dominate the decisions that are being made for weak states. And so it causes this very, very clear vicious cycle. You start with a trade deficit. More money is going out than you're taking in. So you take a loan to cover the gap. right? Thinking, okay, in the future I'll make more money, right? We've talked about this, right? The way people perceive the future, right? There's that discount rate of how you perceive the future, right? The values of the future, or things, their impact that they might have over time, right? That you're like, oh, things will get better over time, so I'll take a loan now and I'll get better, right? But then the debts start piling up, right? And as a state, you hit a point, the state hits a point where it says, I can't pay this debt and pay my fiscal requirements. I can't pay for my services on the set. I need to restructure. And the institutions that exist force conditions, and then one of those conditions that is most damaging is comparative advantage. And so you hit this comparative advantage point, but what happens is you cut tariffs and you open trade. So you're not taxing goods coming in and out of the state, right? So your state revenue is automatically declined. You decrease the amount of bureaucracy, which means you don't have as many customs agents. You don't have as many people checking on whether or not your taxes are being paid, right? Treasury agents, right? You don't have as much of a police force. You have to cut firefighters. You have to cut all these services that actually make your businesses more efficient. And then you don't have any taxes. And so foreign powers are going to bring in more and more goods as you're trying to export your low value added good, right? And then that enforced comparative advantage leads to this point where we have a worse trade deficit, right? And so the last step, comparative advantage, actually feeds back into this first step of a trade deficit: more debt, more conditional loans, more forced austerity, and this theory that eventually you'll get very good at comparative advantage, when in fact historical cases have not supported that. Now, obviously, dependency theory is something coming out of the global south. It suggests that powerful states are intentionally suppressing the economic growth of weak states because it benefits them. Now, that might be true. That definitely might be true, right? Or that definitely could be true. Powerful states, the United States, UK, France, Russia, and China, they have to take care of their population. And so morally, we might question this, right? We talked about this a long time ago in Machiavelli's The Prince. They have an ethics that are different, right? It doesn't matter to leaders in the United States if it disadvantages Argentina, as long as it benefits the United States, right? So their priorities are very different. So some of this is not malicious, but is intentional, right? I want to have the best trade deal I can get, even if it disadvantages or puts Argentina in a bad spot. And in fact, if you're not allies with someone like the United States and China, they're not allies, right? They're not enemies, but they have a very competitive situation. Trade policy impacts a lot of that behavior, right? China and the United States don't really have animosity. It's that China is trying to get better trade deals, and the U.S. is trying to get trade deals, and China and the United States are trying to have more influence over the spheres that they're in. And so they're running into each other, not because of ideological differences or sort of animosity or sort of disdain for the other group. It's that they want things, and the only way to get it is to take it from one of the other groups, right? And so you're seeing that process happen between powerful states, and powerful states can defend themselves, right, through trade issues, right? China doesn't have to accept comparative advantage. Russia didn't have to accept comparative advantage. South Korea didn't because the only person who cared was Western states, and they weren't going to put sanctions on a state that they were allies and have a defense agreement with, right? So they were in a unique position that they could get away with ISI, import substitution industrialization. And so dependency theory really has this sort of static effect, right? That once you're stuck in the lower tier, the global south, the underdeveloped economy, you're sort of just stuck there. And this happens because of the rate of advancement. So the first issue that we talk about is this the treaties for the respect of intellectual property. So intellectual property has, when it first started becoming law, international law, it really sounded like a great thing. If I sell you an iPhone, right, the first iPhone, and I'm Apple, and I sell 1,000 pallets of Apple iPhones to your state, you can't crack that phone open, take all the details, and then make your own phone, right, and produce it using my intellectual property, right? That was the idea, right? If I create something that has value because of its design, its function, right, its advancement, then I should be able to retain that technology. And so I can sell you the equipment and I can sell you the technology, but I retain the intellectual property. And I can sell you the support services because I don't have to tell you how everything works, right? I'm going to say, this is what the machine does. I say, well, how does it work? I'm the one who knows how it works. So if you need repair, maintenance, whatever, you have to call me, right? And so intellectual property is a positive thing in that people can protect the rights of the things that they create. But powerful states often use this to produce, especially a corporation, will often use this to advance economic interests by saying, yes, I'm going to sell you the product, but then I also have to sell you the services and the support, and you have to buy the material from me. And so intellectual property, while a positive thing, is very negative in that interaction between a weak state and a powerful state, because the powerful state corporation, the corporation that exists in the powerful state, is going to have that extractive ability to take wealth away from another state, which is going to cause dependency theory to sort of have this effect where the weak state can't catch up. The worst example of intellectual property sort of being used against a weak state is Monsanto. And Monsanto used to be very like in the news a lot, but also GMOs. I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if GMOs is as big a thing. Like organic movements were very big, but now I don't know if we care as much. But we might just have more on our plates, and we're not talking about it, granted, because it's not. Like, we're dealing with so many other things that it's not like second or third, it's like seventh on the list, and maybe as things get better, it'll come back up, but for now, we're not as concerned about it. But there was this big push to have organic after what Monsanto did. It had an impact because what happened is you had modified corn. It was insect resistant, had larger crop yield, which sounds like a good thing, right? You need to feed more people, so you want it to be insect resistant, you want it to feed more people, this positive thing. But what happened is that corn, the seeds from that corn, they could float on the wind and they could get into other farmers' land, right? So you have your lot is lot A and I'm in lot B. And I have this modified corn and it drifts into your lot A and it starts growing in your lot. Or it starts pollinating your corn to where the strain of corn you have is not dissimilar from my strain of corn. And then I sue you for growing my corn. Right? I sue you because I say, you're growing my corn, look at the DNA strain, obviously that person's growing my corn, but I'm the one who pollinated your cornfield because of the way the setup's going, right? It was my fault. Essentially, my product spilled over into your yard and contaminated it with GMOs, right? If we're going to use that sort of language of contamination, right? And then I'm going to sue you because you're growing my product. And this became one of the clearest examples of intellectual property being used against weaker states to extract wealth, right? Now, I don't actually know the outcome of that Monsanto case. I have to look that up. But it became news, right, that intellectual property is now being used to suppress weaker states by saying, look, I can retain the intellectual property, which you want to be able to retain intellectual property, but then I can use it to make it even more imbalanced trade relationship. And if the trade relationship is so imbalanced, then it's impossible for that state to develop. The last part, right, about dependency theory is the speed of advancement, right? How fast do you advance? The United States and a few other places in the world, the technology advancement is very, very fast, right? We are rapidly moving through technology, right? The fact that we were able to get a vaccine from not knowing about a disease to getting a vaccine within a year is a huge advancement in technology. Huge investment. The fact that 3 companies got to it within a year is a massive advance. Vaccines usually take multiple years, right? That's why there might be side effects, right? But the development has happened so fast. It's a huge advancement in technology, right? And all those other factors. And on a side note, I don't know if we're having this debate about, but the vaccines are very safe. There are some people who are going to have side effects. Yes, there are some people who are going to have side effects. But you're also, what are we at, like 150 million people? We should expect a few hundred people to have adverse reactions, right? If we injected them with saline water, we'd expect a certain reaction. So on a quick side note, right? Vaccines are safe, but they're not, right, perfectly safe, right? They might be 99.9% safe, but if they were 99.99% safe, 1 in 1,000 would have an adverse reaction. And we injected over 150 million people, right? So you should expect quite a few people to have an adverse reaction. How bad is the reaction, things like that, right? So you might be calculating that cost, but what we should recognize in this context, in the dependency theory context, is powerful states like the UK, like Russia and China and the United States, we were so much faster, those states were so much faster developing a vaccine because they're already so much more technologically advanced, right? So it's like having a head start, right? Even if you were running at the same speed, if I started 10 seconds before you, I'm always going to be 10 seconds ahead. Well, now it's not just that I'm 10 seconds ahead, but that I'm accelerating faster than you're accelerating. So I started 10 seconds ahead, and then now I'm 11 seconds and 12 seconds. And you're advancing, right? You're advancing through technology as fast as you can, but I have such a head start that I'm just getting farther and farther away. And this becomes one of the sort of very pessimistic aspects of dependency theory. Not only will intellectual property, international institutions, and other factors make it impossible to escape these rules that are forcing you to have this trade deficit, right? Like the trade deficit is already bad enough, but the technology is advancing that even if you develop machinery, so you didn't have to buy the machinery from the global north, that machinery would still be better because their speed of advancement is faster, right? So one of the issues about dependency theory that people take is that it's fatalistic, right? It's deterministic, right? Weak states can never develop because they are always being suppressed or outpaced by the global north, right? And so this becomes dependency theory's main point, right? That weak states are stuck as weak states. They're stuck as underdeveloped because they can never catch up. And we need some sort of answer for them to be able to catch up, some sort of way for them to get into the next stage. And so the biggest part about the next stage, or how do you get into the next stage, how do you get to that point, right, is we would have to share technology. We would have to say, here's the technology, we're going to sell it to you, and we're going to give you intellectual property. Now, most of the global north, right, Russia, Western Europe, and the United States, they don't own that intellectual property, right? This is where we hit this really big point of how do you fix this problem. The global north doesn't own the property. The corporations own the property, and they are protected by law because they fought very hard to have the law that way, that states can't take their property further. China's a unique example. It does have a lot of technology, but the government could seize on it at any point. The rest of the global north doesn't really have an answer because they're going to say, well, that's not my intellectual property to give you. I can protect it on behalf of the corporations, the American corporations, the French corporations, the Russian corporations, but it's not mine to give away, right? And it's unlikely, especially now when corporations are making high profits, that they would give away those profits for some normative cost, right? We can't expect corporations, which are designed to make money, to give away the thing that makes them money, right? That's not a realistic expectation. Right? So as much as I hate to end on a pessimistic theory, right, that's dependency theory, right? It goes through a very clear cycle, right? And I'm going to go to the vicious cycle so you can see, right? You have a trade imbalance. You're spending more than you're taking in, right? Your revenue is less than your, right, your extractive capacity is less than your fiscal requirement, right? Fiscal requirement being how much you need to make to pay for all the costs of the state, right? The bureaucracy jobs, the military, the firefighters, right? The paper, the resources, right? Welfare society, right? Social security, whatever it is, these fiscal requirement covers everything, and it is more than the extractive capacity. Taxes, rents, right? Incomes, tariffs, right? Your costs are more than your income, right? And that leads to a loan. And when you take out a loan, you can only have two things happen, right? Either you pay back the loan because you need it for a short amount of time, or that loan pushes you farther and farther into financial difficulty. And eventually, for states that have too much debt and run into a lot, they start to get to a restructuring. They have to ask for a restructuring loan. And a restructured loan just says, I can't pay my payments. I need you to loan me enough money that I can pay this month and next month's bills, and then restructure my debt that I can make the payments and cover my expenses, right? And so this is a very difficult loan to ask for. A restructured loan is very difficult. But there's no bankruptcy, right? There's only default. So international institutions, they want to give you a restructuring loan because they want to be able to say, yes, keep paying your bills, and then we'll change the payments so that you can handle this. And we have seen, I want to say like 10 years ago, we did see the World Bank and the IMF start to forgive debt. They said, look, you're never going to pay this back. You're going to be indebted the whole time. And so there's these HIPCs. HIPCs is a term for, I think this is going to be workable. I won't touch on this, but it just, it's a heavily indebted poor country, right? A heavily indebted poor country doesn't make a lot of money, has a ton of debt that they can never pay off, and so the World Bank came said, well, let's forgive a portion of your debt so that you can start developing, but because there's no way that you're paying so much of your revenue into this debt that you're never going to escape it, right? And so there is some forgiveness we've seen over the last few years. It hasn't happened in the last few years because the pandemic is sort of like pandemic and then other factors really took this over. But there is, for very, very poor countries, there is a solution where this would get forgiveness. But it's rare, and it's usually not because they ask for it. It's usually because an economist determines that they'll never pay it back. Right? One of the reasons why debt gets forgiven outside of a governmental context is that the lender realizes, I will never get this money. I don't even want to spend the effort to go after it. I know I'm not going to get it. Why pursue it? It's not worth it. And so there's debt forgiveness there. Or, right, they just erase it or they just write it off. And this happens quite a bit, right, but just not on a state level. Okay. So that is all the material that we are going to cover this semester. There are two papers. I'm going to give you an extra credit where you can write about one of them, so it'll be like 112% total in the class, but it's fine. You don't need to read them, so if you're watching the recording or if you're watching it live, right, you don't have to read them. They are not in the exam. I have already written the exam. They are not on the exam. So the last part, let's see if I can fix this. Hold on one second. For those of you watching the recording, I know it looks kind of crazy, but sorry. I think sometimes I ask the computer to do too many things at the same time. All right, so let's go to the Word document. There we go. All right, so share Word document. I know that one or two of you have turned in the paper, but it is due next week. So I just want to go over and look at the rubric. And so the first part that, oh no, I didn't just drop that. Okay, I'll look for it afterwards. The first part is that you need some sort of hypothesis. What do you want to test, right? So think of a question that you think the material discusses and that you can answer based on the material that you read. So here's the first tip that I want to give you if you're working on the paper in the next week. Don't write a question and then look for sources. Take the three sources that you've read and you know, right? Find the three that you know already and say, what question are they dealing with? Even if it doesn't seem like they're connected, find a connection between those three because you already know that material, so you don't have to go back and read. You don't have to go look at the three things, find three articles or three readings that you were able to really dig your teeth into, or that you took good notes, or that you just know about, right? Because you want to look at those three and say, okay, Levitsky and we talk about regime change, and Scotchwell talks about regime change, and I took good notes on those, and then we talked about dependency theory and modernization theory, and so those are simple enough that I can combine them. So I'm going to say, okay, what is really causing regime change? Is it an autonomous public? Is it Scotchwell's argument? Is it that regimes are stabilizing because of cohesive parties? Is it that modernization is occurring and they're just sort of a natural process? All three of those are also deterministic arguments. You could say, look, are all scientists in this field just looking at the structure? That's a reasonable question, right? Is the field too focused on structure? And you could say, look at these three articles, look how focused they are, and point out all the structural arguments that they make. And then you're going to go to the next part, right? So you have a question, it's not normative, right? It's dealing with the material that you've already read. So pick the articles that you already know, and what questions can you ask based on those things. Just save yourself time, right? And then really get into the knowledge, right? Show knowledge. So make sure that you're saying, this is my understanding, this is my language, right? Don't use quotes, right? I don't like that I have to keep saying this, but I just got more stuff that has too many quotes in it. Don't use quotes. Say it in your own words, what you think the material is saying. Because I'm going to give you more points for saying this is what I think, even if you're off by a bit, right? If you're just guessing because you didn't read the material, I'm going to know, right? But if you're like, I think this is what it says, and I'm like, oh, you're a little off, I'm going to give you 85, 90%, even if you're wrong, because I know what you're pulling from, and I can see where you made a mistake, but you're still showing me that you read the material, even if there's some confusion. Right? I'm going to give you most of the points. Even if there's some confusion, I'm going to give you most of the points. Because you're saying, I read it, this is what it says. I may not have understood it perfectly, but I do understand what the material was, and I'm showing you that I've read it. So use your own words. If you show me a quote, you could just go to any page. I've done this when I was undergrad. You go to a page, you're like, copy, paste, quote. I'm sure that's close enough, right? Just find a quote that sort of works. I'm not going to give you as many points for that because you're not demonstrating knowledge, you're just pasting from a quote, right? And sometimes when you put the quote in, you make an argument, you're like, oh, democracy is really good, and then your quote says democracy is bad for collecting taxes, right? And you said, no, democracy is great for collecting taxes. And so when you're doing that, right, if your quotes don't match what you're saying, then obviously that you're sort of filling in and you're going to get less points for that. So use your own words. Try not to use a quotation mark at all. Don't put quotation marks in your work. Don't put normative statements in your work. And then when you write about, you're like, oh, here's this paper I read, I'm talking about it. At the end of a sentence or at the end of a paragraph where you're talking about it, if you're talking about the material in the reading, add an in-text citation. And here you can see an in-text citation, right? I'm talking about the material, and then I add a parentheses, the author last name, right? And if there's more than one author, just list them in a row. If there's more than three, in fact, if there's one author, put the author's name. If there's more than one, you want to list the author last names. But if you did the first last name and you missed the others, I'm not going to punish you for that. Right? That if you made a citation mistake, because I don't know how much training you guys have had on citations. But you need the author last name, and then the year, and then period. So because you're citing the work, I don't want the title of the article. I don't want the names of the authors. I just want this in-text citation. Because everything else in the paper should be your language explaining to me what you have read and understood. Okay? So that's 10 points. That's half of the whole paper. If you demonstrate all the knowledge and you fail at almost everything else, you're still going to get half of the points. Right? Just demonstrate that you read 3 articles. And when you demonstrate that you read 3 articles, make sure that you're making the points in the article and not the points I made in the PowerPoint. Remember, in the PowerPoint, I'm translating for you into other language. I'm adding points that aren't necessarily in that text, right? In fact, if you look back through my slides, some of them say not in text, not in the readings, right? Because I'm adding something that you need to know about this material that they assume, right? The author's assuming that you're very knowledgeable, right? Because they're writing for a political journal, right? I'm adding and giving you context, so not everything in the PowerPoints directly pulls from the readings. So sometimes you're like, oh, Shorsky said this. No, I said that, right? If you look, Shorsky was a little bit less committed to that point, right? I was making that point, right? If you look at the article on dependency theory, I simplified dependency quite a bit so that it's understandable. Theirs is much more complex, more detailed, more nuanced, right? And so make sure you're citing the material that you read. And also make sure that you're citing, right, the right person, right? Don't miss a cite. All right, so now you're at 12 points. You created a question based on the readings that you know. You demonstrated to me that you've read them, right? So now you're at 12 points, right? You only have 8 points left. The next is a research design. Now, I didn't include research design in the final exam, so don't go back too far. There are some methodological questions, but there aren't any essay questions. So you should know that, but you're not going to have a ton of questions about methodology, ontology, epistemology. You shouldn't have too many questions about that. Maybe 1 or 2. The reason is because I want you to demonstrate in the research design. Tell me, I have this question. And then think about, what is the nature of the world, right? Is this an objective reality where I can count things, where I can say how many trees fell or how many people died? right? Is this an intersubjective, right? We have the shared meaning of what it means to what things mean, right? We have the shared understanding, right? One of the things about intersubjective reality is that the community, the academic community, really started to support the Chicago School in the 1990s, right? They said, yeah, comparative advantage is the way to go because they shared that perception that comparative advantage was best. And the last, subjective reality, right? Where are you at? What does that mean for how you can gain knowledge? So when you're designing, when you're doing your research design, say, I have this question, this literature says, right, when you're showing the literature in the knowledge of material, you're saying, this is what the literature is saying. So now I want to make a test. I want to create something, right? It can be an experiment. It can be a case study. It can be regression analysis, right? Whatever you're most comfortable describing and how you would answer this question, just make sure you're discussing it in the language we've developed in the comparative politics, right? Is it quantitative or qualitative, right? Are you going to ask people their opinions and then put it on some scale? Or are you going to just ask people questions and try to get a feel for it, right, in a case study? Or are you going to go to certain states and look at it? Or are you going to collect all this data and run a regression analysis, right? What are the steps are you going to take to try and answer the question that you have posed? That's going to be the last part of the paper, right? Here is how I would do it. I don't want you to actually do it. I don't want you to set up a regression analysis. That's something you're going to learn in 312. What I do want from you, right, is to go about and say, how would you answer scientifically a question you have posed? Right? What's the most scientific way to answer this question? And what would be a reliable test? And so this should be fairly long, about half a page to a page, where you're describing in detail. Make sure you approach this scientifically, right? So look back on some of the early slides of what it means to be scientific, right? Falsifiable, repeatable, things like that. But also why it would give you the answer, right? Why would regression analysis or quantitative methods be better in this situation, right? Why would case studies be better? Why would, process tracing? If you're going to use process tracing, be very careful. It's very difficult to get process tracing right. But case studies, qualitative approach. Regression analysis, quantitative approach. Get those language going for that last part. So you've demonstrated the knowledge, you show me how to answer the question. That's 18 points, right? That's 18 points. And then the last part is a complete paper, right? Make sure that it has an introduction and conclusion. So my advice to you is write the theory, which is the literature part, right? Write the knowledge. Here's the material that I'm discussing. Here's the research design. And then what you should do is you should add an intro and conclusion, because an intro should say, here's what I did, here's what I'm going to do. An introduction is, here's what I'm going to do. And a conclusion is, here's what I did, right? So your intro and conclusion should actually be written last. Even though people say, oh, I didn't intro. No, if you're doing a scientific paper, you should write, here's the literature, here's the research design, and then if you did a full paper, here's the analysis, but we're not going to do that. And then you add the intro and conclusion, because what you think the paper is going to be doesn't actually turn out to be the same paper. So when you're reading through your knowledge area and your research design, the next step is to say, okay, my introduction should say, here's what I'm going to do. My conclusion should say, here's what I did, right? And that'll make it easier to write the paper. Make sure you're using in-text citations. Use in-text citations in the introduction. If you're discussing literature and you're saying, oh, I'm going to discuss this literature, cite it there too, right? Cite in the introduction, cite in the conclusion, cite in the knowledge area. If you make reference to the material, cite in the research design, right? Make sure you're using in-text citation whenever you're discussing an article, even if just loosely, right? If you're like, oh, we're going to discuss social revolution, you should cite Scotchpole, because you're saying the type of social revolution we're going to discuss is that which Scotchpole discusses, right? So make sure you're doing in-text citation. And then the last part, so here we have, that's 20 points, right? Make sure it's a complete paper, make sure you have knowledge of material, make sure you have a research design that is obvious. If you don't include a works cited in an in-text citation, and I prefer Chicago style, but I'm not going to penalize you either way. If you don't submit a paper with a works cited, you're going to get a 0. You're going to get a 0. You have to have a works cited and you have to have in-text citation, okay? So just make sure, write the paper, and as you're going, if you're not sure, right, and let me just show you a good way if I can do this, right? If you're not sure, let me increase the font dramatically. You're like, oh, I know this belongs to something, but I don't know what, right? If you do something like this is what I do. It might be functional for you, I don't know. But I'm just saying here, I don't know yet. I know there's an author, but I'm not sure, right? And so if you're, depending on how you're writing, right? If you're like, I'm flowing, I want to go through this, here's the author that I think it is, but I just can't remember the exact citation, right? So just make a marker there, and then later, if it's going to show up, you can Control F, right? And you can search for these markers and fill in the authors to make sure that you don't miss anything, right? So this is a way that you can keep writing. You're like, I want to have my flow of writing, and I can add these markers, and then I'm going to look at this and say, okay, where did I pull this from? And then fill in the authors later. The only problem with this is if you forget to do this part, you'll get a big penalty on your grade, right? You need to fill in these markers, right? That should be part of it. But that's one way to do it, right? The other way is get to the end of the sentence and be like, okay, I need to know what this is, right? So I'm going to go back and stop writing, maybe interrupt my flow, but maybe that way I don't forget this, and I'm going to go look up, and it's Hagstrom, and this could be wrong because I'm not looking at it right now, and I don't have these dates memorized, right? But you're like, oh, that was Hagstrom, and then you keep writing, right? But one way or the other, make sure you're putting a marker in that says this is what I need to do to make sure there's a citation, in-text citation, okay? So we've covered the, are there any questions from the people that are actually here? Sorry, I dropped something and I'm completely blind. Right, that is the paper. Make sure you turn it in. The only thing that I will say is do not submit to me a paper that you sort of rewrote from someone else's paper. Do not submit to me a paper that has way too many quotes. High quote levels, whenever you quote, that's all considered the same as, that's similar as other material. So if your paper is 30% quotes, your plagiarism report is going to be 30%, 35%, because the names and some of the other things are very, terminology is similar in some cases. So that to me, I'm not saying, okay, that's not cheating, but that means 30% of your paper you didn't write. You pasted from a quote, right? Or you pulled from quotes of other works. So avoid quotes, make sure it's your work, and make sure that even if you work with someone, make sure you're writing separate papers, right? You can collaborate, but you need to have separate papers. And if you have a plagiarism score that's over 35%, I'm probably going to either give you a 0 or I'm going to report it, right? If it looks like, oh, you did quotes and it's obvious to me that you just sort of messed something up, I'm going to give you a low grade and I'm going to say, here's what you can do to fix it, which is why it has to be in by the 30th, because it's going to take me a while to grade all of these and I have to be in a position to actually give you your grade back before grades are due, right? Because you don't want to get a surprise 0 on this. Make sure that you are writing your own paper and get this done because it's 20% of grade. This is worth more than the final exam. This is more important than the final exam. I can work with you on the exams. I cannot work with the papers. It takes too long to grade, too long to get through. Okay, so that is it for today. That's going to be it for today. We will have class next Friday. Papers will be in. They're due next Friday, so papers will be in. I will grade anything that comes in early. The exams will be all through. Go through, get as much as you can. Make sure you do the last quiz and make sure you do the participation assignment, right? And look at what the participation assignment is because I'm going to be correcting your grades this week. And a lot of you are going to find yourself in sort of that B, A range, and you're going to think about how much effort I want to put into. If you're below the B range, then you can either come talk to me about what you can do. But if you haven't done every quiz and every extra credit, there's no discussion. There's so many opportunities for your grade to increase. Make sure you're doing those first. If you're failing the last week of the semester, the finals week, I'm going to reach out to you and try to make some sort of plan with you to get you to a C. But if we are making a plan, the highest grade you can get a C. No matter how hard you try, if we're already making a plan and I have to open doors, your grade can't get better than a C because at that point, I'm not going to say, oh, I'm going to make more effort for you to do. I'm just trying to get you to pass because I know how hard this semester has been. Okay, so I hope everyone has a good day. If you're watching the recordings, I know we had a lot of technical difficulties, but I hope that everything is clear. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. So thank you and have a good day.